Hello and welcome to the Stamperia Serve Vagabond and Fantasy World tutorial series designed for Scrap and Create. All of these products that are available on the Scrap and Create website are linked in the description box below, so you can purchase these products and follow along. Let's get into the tutorial. In today's tutorial, we are going to begin building the cover for the album. I have my heavyweight chipboard here. I've cut two pieces to 6.5 by 8.5. Then for my spine piece, I've cut this to 2.5 by 8.5. Next, we need to cut our cardstock pieces, and then we're going to wrap our covers. I have two pieces. They're cut to 7.5 by 9.5. On the bottom of each one, I have measured 1/2 inch up from the bottom edge. Then I have drawn a line here, and this is where I'm going to be placing my pieces. Next, I have one piece that measures 4.25 by 9.5, and the same thing, I drew a 1/2 inch line here across the bottom edge is 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the page, and this is where I'm going to place my spine. Then I have my final piece that measures 4.25 by 8 3/8 inch. I have one of my 7.5 by 9.5 inch pieces and one of my chipboard covers. What I'm going to do is apply my adhesive to my cover, and I'm going to place this down here. I will be using my tacky glue for this step. You can use whatever adhesive you prefer to use here. Now, if you have never followed one of my tutorials before, I don't typically show steps like gluing unless I'm explaining something as I'm doing it. So my tutorials are designed for you to pause, complete the step, and then follow the rest of the tutorial. So they are edited so that you will not see certain steps. It will give you time to go ahead and do those steps and then come back to the tutorial. Once you have your adhesive on the back of your chipboard, just want to go ahead and use that guide. Place your chipboard down on the paper, and that will give it that uniform 1/2 inch border all the way around your piece. And then use your bone folder to adhere this down. If you are new to making mini albums, a bone folder is a really important tool to use to help things to lay flat, so you want to make sure that you invest in a bone folder. Once I have my chipboard on, I'm going to come in here and miter my corners. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the paper out, but I'm leaving about 1/8 inch past my corner. That way I have some paper left to wrap my corners. If you do not feel comfortable just cutting this like that, you can use a ruler and you can measure, so there's about 1/8 inch. Now, once I have my corners removed, I'm just going to go with the short ends first and the long ends and just get this started. And now, coming with my bone folder, I'm going to crease my short ends up and over my chipboard. So I want this to be wrapped really snug up against my chipboard. Then I'm going to take my adhesive here, and I'm just going to apply it to this tab section, and then flip this right back over, making sure that it's, again, nice and tight up against that edge, and then burnishing it down on top of the chipboard. And I'll do the same thing with this opposite side. When you're doing this, you want to make sure that you run your bone folder against that edge so that it does adhere to the edge and it's not puckering at all. Once you have these two edges, you're going to take your bone folder and you're going to tuck that corner in. So I'm just going to press up against my chipboard, making sure that that corner tucks in. You should be able to see this on your own. It might be a little harder to see on mine, but if I bring it up here, hopefully you can see that that corner now is tucked in. Then I'm going to take my longer sides and I'm going to do the same thing as I did with my shorter sides and make sure that the edges are nice and tight, and then wrap my paper around my chipboard onto the top. So now you should have these nice, tight, crisp corners. I'm going to take my adhesive and apply it to the first side. Then I'm going to use my bone folder and adhere this down, again running it along the edge to make sure that that's nice and smooth, making sure that these corners are nice and tight as well. And then making sure that this is burnished down on top of my chipboard. And then all we have to do is repeat with the final side. Sometimes your corners might extend over a little bit, like mine are a little bit pointy, so I'm just rounding them down a little bit so that they're not quite as pointy and they won't be as noticeable sticking up. Again, making sure that you do go against that edge so that it's nice and crisp and clean. So now we have our first cover wrapped. So this is the outside, this will be the inside. I'm going to repeat that process with my second cover. I'm going to do this off camera. Since you've already done one, you do the same thing with this one. Then I'll come back and show you how to do the spine. Now that both of my covers are done, I'm going to focus on my spine piece. I have the 4 1/4 by 9 1/2 inch piece, and I have my 2 1/2 by 8 1/2 inch chipboard piece. And I'm going to be placing this here in the center. Now these sides are longer than 1/2 inch and they're supposed to be. So what we want to do is make sure that we adhere the chipboard piece right into the center of the paper. So it's going to be about 3/4 inch on each side that will be extending out. So these are tabs that we're going to use to adhere or to attach the spine to the cover. So once I have my adhesive down, I'm going to just eye this and place this down. If you want to measure yours, you can. But I'm just going to try to get this to be pretty centered, using that bottom line as a guide for the bottom edge, and then I'll burnish this down. With this piece, we're not going to be cutting the corners at all. I'm going to take this and I'm just going to fold this over on both of these shorter edges. And then I'm going to take my bone folder, and just like with my cover pieces, I'm going to run it up the top edge, and then I'm going to hold this down over my spine, and then I'm going to press my paper up against that edge and then press this flat. I'm going to do this on both sides. And what you will notice is these pieces curve slightly down, or they slant slightly down, because this is wrapping up against my spine. So the piece comes down just a little tiny bit, and that is what we want, because then it will make it easier when the album covers come on, that the paper will not extend out too far. So again, just like on the last side, I'm going to wrap that edge first, then I'm going to hold it over the chipboard piece, and then I'm going to press it up against the long edge and down. And now that I have those pieces creased, I'm just going to take my adhesive and I'm going to apply it to this whole 1/2 inch section here across the entire part of the cardstock. And then I'm going to refold this and do the same thing. First, making sure the edge and the chipboard piece are good, and then I'm going to crease it right down that edge. Same thing on this side. I'll apply my adhesive first to this whole entire 1/2 inch area, and then flip this up. Make sure that it's nice and flush with the edge, and then on the chipboard before I finish with these little tabs. Once I have those adhered down, I'm going to flip over, take my bone folder, and I'm going to carefully run my bone folder up the side and press that paper up against that side of the spine piece. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Once I flip this over, you will see now that these wings or tabs are completely flat up against my spine piece. I'm going to flip back over to the outside. I'm going to take my ruler here, and I'm going to place this against the ruler and use my ruler as a guide. I'm going to take one of my covers, and I'm going to be placing it here right up against my spine. So my ruler will act as a way to make sure that these edges are straight. Now this method is the lay flat method. You do not leave a space between your spine piece and your cover piece like you do if you're doing the full wrap method. So I'm going to take my adhesive here, and I'll be applying it on this whole entire section. You want to make sure that you don't go into or on top of that spine section when you do this, because you will see that adhesive. So just be careful when you're applying your adhesive here that it stays on this wing or this tab. And then again, I'm going to use my ruler as a guide, and I'm just going to set my cover down right next to it. I'm going to press those together so that there is no space, and then I will use my bone folder to adhere this down. And then I like to come into the back side and make sure that I press everything down here too. I'm going to flip this over now to this side just because it's easier for me to do this while I'm on camera. I'm going to add my adhesive to my second wing or tab section and then add my second cover. Just like before, I'll use my ruler to make sure everything is straight and flat. I'm going to line up my cover and my spine piece right next to each other, and then use my bone folder to burnish this down. Flipping over on the inside again, I'm just going to make sure that this is adhered really well. I'm going to next take my 4 1/4 by 8 3/8 inch piece, And when I set it here, it is the same exact size as the piece with the tabs, but it is slightly smaller top and bottom than my 8.5-inch cover. So I'm going to just adhere this down to that spine section to cover my chipboard there. Now, when I apply my adhesive here, I want to be very careful and make sure this entire piece is covered, especially if you're preferring double-sided tape here, you need to cover this entire surface. But if you're using wet adhesive like I am, you want to make sure that you don't use too much adhesive because it will warp as well. So you just want to make sure that you spread out your adhesive if you're using wet adhesive. Once you have your adhesive on, just go ahead and align everything up using those sides as your guide, and then just a little teeny border at the top and bottom where this is just a little bit smaller than the cover. And then use your bone folder to press this down. Now I'm going to make sure this is adhered really well, and then I'm going to let this dry before I actually bend this into the book shape. For now, I'm just going to leave this as is. We're going to come in here as we're waiting for this to dry and work on our hinges. For our hinges, we're going to need 2 pieces of cardstock. The first one cut to 2.5 by 8.25. The second one cut to 3.5 by 8.25. Now we're going to take both of these pieces to our scoreboard and score this every 1/2 inch across the smaller sides. We're going to do the same thing on the 2.5-inch piece, scoring every 1/2 inch. Before I fold on my score lines, I'm going to take my scissors from the first score line. I'm going to cut and miter the ends of the first 1/2 inch tab section on both sides so that my piece will look like this. I'm going to do the same thing on my larger section of hinge and just miter the ends on those 1/2 inch end pieces. Now what I'm going to do is take my bone folder and fold on those score lines. I like to start in the center, and I fold in the center, then I will hold this so that everything is centered and go from the center outward. That will stop my paper from shifting and my fold from not being straight. And then I'll come in here, do the same thing on the next one. And I'm going to just fold on all of these score lines on both pieces. And I'm also going to fold in both directions. So once I finish with this one, I'm going to flip this over. And now I'm going to fold the paper in the opposite direction and use my bone folder to crease these folds in that direction. This is just allowing my hinges to bend and move a lot easier. That way when I go to flip my pages, it is easier for them to move. So I will repeat that same process with my larger hinge, then we'll come back and put them together. Now that I have my hinges folded, I'm going to take the larger. Got my 3 sections in the center. I'm going to fold 2 over from the side on both sides and just crease this like this. I'm going to take my smaller hinge. I did the same thing, so I have my center section. This just helps me to know where to place this piece a lot easier. I'm going to apply my adhesive to this 1/2 inch tab section in the center of my smaller hinge. Now, if you are using your double-sided tape here, again, make sure that you have this completely covered with tape. If you're using wet adhesive, make sure that you have wet adhesive on the entire piece. Now I'm going to take this and adhere this to that center 1/2 inch section on my larger hinge. And first what I'm going to do is just eye it to make sure it is correct. I will fold one of these over and use that score line to line it up. Then carefully fold the other one over to make sure that it is in line. And now I will burnish this down. And I like to take the two hinges that are not adhered down and fold them over, and then burnish this just again so that these folds are nice and crisp, but also to make sure that all that adhesive is distributed and everything is adhered down. So now I have these two for the middle 2 pages, and then these two are for my outer pages. So this hinge is what I'm going to be adhering into my album. Before we can adhere our hinges into our album, we need to first finish up with this. So now that this piece is dry, I'm going to take my bone folder and just very lightly run it down into that crease as I bend up on my cover. And then once I get so far, I can just go ahead and bend it on its own. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this side, using my bone folder first just to help that paper to bend and move, and then lifting up on that cover. So now I have those covers. They will bend and move freely, but then when it's open, it will lay flat, hence the name, the lay flat method. I'm going to go ahead and erase that measurement because I don't want it to be visible once my album is done. Next, I'm going to take my centering ruler. If you are not using a centering ruler, I highly recommend one, but if you are not using one, you will need to measure over either 3/4 of an inch from the center or 1/2 inch from the edge. So I'm measuring over 3/4 from center, but you can also measure from this crease 1/2 inch and make a mark. I'm going to do this on the top and the bottom. And this is where my hinge is going to go. Now my hinge is smaller than my cover by 1/4 of an inch. So we're going to have 1/8 of an inch on the top and 1/8 of an inch on the bottom. With your hinges up, so you've got 3 1/2 inch sections here. You've got this 1.5 inch surface that you need to completely cover with your adhesive. Then we're going to adhere that to the spine where you've made those marks. I'm just going to take my hinge piece and use those guides to line everything up. Again, making sure I have 1/8 of an inch at the top and the bottom. Once I have that on, I will go ahead and burnish this down. Now we have our 4 hinges for our pages and our album cover. For the closure band on the cover, I have a piece of cardstock cut to 5 inches by 1.5 inches. On the 5-inch side, I'm going to score this at 1.5 and 4 3/8. I'm going to fold on these score lines and use my bone folder to crease those folds. And then I will bring in my cover here, and I'm going to mark on the back cover in the center where I'm going to adhere down my closure band. So because it is 1.5 inches, I need to measure over 3/4 from the center. And I'm going to take my adhesive on the inside of this. Just on that section. And now I will apply this here, making sure that the score line is actually off the edge of the cover. That way this piece will close correctly. And once I have that in place, I can go ahead and burnish this down. So now this piece will come up here like this, and that's where my closure piece will come in here. And if you don't like this, or if you don't have this, you can also put a magnet here when we go to do the cover. For now though, I'm going to leave this just like that because we can't put this on until we have our decorative papers on for our cover. For the base pages, you want to cut 4 pieces to 5 7/8 by 9 1/4 inches. On the 9 1/4 inch side, we need to score this at 1/2 inch and 8 3/4 inch. Then we're going to take scissors and miter the ends on those 1/2 inch tab sections. And you're going to do this on all 4 of your pieces. I have already done this with my other 3. Next, you're going to cut 4 pieces that measure 5 7/8 by 8 1/4 inches for the back side. We need to take each of our front pieces with our scored sections and burnish on those score lines to fold these tabs back and prepare them to make pocket pages. Once we have those, this piece should be the same exact size. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do one at a time. I'm going to apply my adhesive here to this 1/2 inch tab section on my piece. And then I'll take the back and I'm just going to line up those top edges and the side edges. Once it's all lined up, I'll use my bone folder to burnish this down. Then I'll go ahead and open up my page and apply my adhesive to my second tab. And then I'm going to close this page up to form that pocket page. Now on this one, I'm going to start with the one that was already adhered down so that this page lays nice and flat. I like my pockets to be really tight so that things don't fall out of them. So this is how I've found is the easiest way to make sure that there's not a large gap. Then I'll burnish from this side. And we have our pocket page. So the hinge will go here and our photo mat will go inside. I'm going to repeat that process with the other 3 pages. Now that I have my 4 base pages and my album base finished, this tutorial is done. In the next tutorial, I'm going to start building up each of my base pages. So there'll be separate tutorials. So we'll start with page 1, then we'll do 2, 3, and 4. Then after that, I will go through and start decorating, starting with the cover and then going through my pages. I hope you will stay tuned for the rest of the tutorial and follow along. And don't forget, if you were just joining in on the video and you didn't catch the supply video, there is a complete list in the description box below of all the supplies that you will need, but also all the links for all the products that are available on the Scrap and Create website. I'll see you in the next tutorial.